From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is David Feldman. Steve Scrovan is having technical difficulties, so he may join us later on in the show. We're coming to you from Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, and I believe New Haven, Connecticut. So sometimes we have some technical difficulties. And of course, we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, David.
On the show, we welcome back Yale history professor Timothy Snyder. If you're a regular listener, you may recall our conversation with Professor Snyder about his book On Tyranny, where he took his knowledge of how fascism took hold in Europe in the 1930s and applied it to trends he was seeing in America today. His latest book explores a similar theme. It's entitled The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. And it's a chronicle of the rise of authoritarianism to various degrees in those three places. Then we're going to be joined by journalist Mark Plotkin, who is going to tell us all about the District of Columbia's push for statehood. Over 700,000 American citizens in Washington, D.C. do not have the same representation as the rest of us do. And Mr. Plotkin is going to give us some of the history of that struggle and the chances of D.C. statehood ever becoming a reality. Somewhere in the middle, we will break things up by checking in with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have time at the end, Ralph will answer more of your questions. But first, let's talk about the threat of authoritarianism in today's world. Professor Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale. Last year's handbook On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, first written as a Facebook post in the wake of Donald Trump's ascension to the White House, went on to becoming a New York Times bestseller. His latest book is The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Timothy Snyder.
So very glad to be with you.
Yes, indeed, Professor Snyder. We were very pleased to interview you when you came out with your little book on tyranny, which really hit a chord because unlike most academics who bewailed the victory by the Electoral College of Donald Trump in November 2016, you sat down and did something about it. And you wrote this little book which basically warned people that there's no society where authoritarianism can't become embedded. Ours is not accepted, and you showed some comparisons with your research in Europe. And what I think people liked about it, also, you had some pages on what to do about it, what citizens individually can do about it. In this book, you elaborate some of the themes, and in your book on page 249, you say, quote, authoritarianism arrives not because people say they want it, but because they lose the ability to distinguish between facts and feelings, end quote. Why do they lose that ability?
I think it's a natural human inclination. We want to hear the things that we want to hear. That's the way that we are. We want to be affirmed in the things we already believe. We want things to be easy. We want to be around people who feel the same way that we do. That's a natural situation. And it's because we're that way that our politics has to set checks on that. You know, it's because we're that way that we have to have the institutions that we do. It's because we're that way that we have to have some sense of authority in the world. That's what the public sphere is about. I mean, from the Greeks to us, the public sphere is a place where there are facts, where there are authorities, where you and I can have discussions, even though we've got our own subjective preferences, we've got our own things that we like to hear, but we acknowledge that there's this public place where it's either rain or it's not, where there's either climate change or there isn't, and we acknowledge that, and that enables us to group together as a political community. If we give up on that public sphere, if we give up on the facts, if we all retreat back to what we want to hear, then it's very easy to govern us by way of spectacle. It's also very easy to turn us against each other, because if all we have are the feelings of who we are, then we just become an us and a them, and there's nothing left over.
Well, let's dig a little deeper. In your book, you show how in the poorest counties, such as in West Virginia, they voted overwhelmingly for Trump. So let's take your point. People want to believe what they want to believe. Well, so why don't they want to believe about the facts that the minimum wage is frozen on them at $7.25 federally? Why don't they want to believe that we're the only Western country that denies them universal health care? Why don't they want to believe that there is a double standard in criminal justice vis-a-vis corporations and individuals. In other words, even if they want to go with their feelings, they can go with their feelings attached to real facts. Why don't they do that?
Well, you're asking me the million-dollar question. I mean, if I could answer that for you, you'd be president, or I would be president. But first of all, I want to thank you for asking right away about Chapter 6. I mean, Chapter 6 is the part of the book that lands in the U.S., and most folks, by the time they interview me, they've read the first few chapters, so we end up talking just about Russia. And my book is about how Russia and America are one big story, as opposed to Russia just kind of picking on us in a certain way. And that story has to do with inequality. And the first thing I want to say is that inequality affects our ability to talk to one another. I mean, one of the tragedies of wealth inequality in this country is that it means that people don't feel like they're in the same communicative universe. And so the things that you're saying to me, might make sense because you and I are kind of in the same place, economically, if I can be so bold as to say that. But when people don't see a future, or they see a future when things are only going down, some of the things that might seem straightforward start to seem less straightforward. And I guess another point I would make is in the U.S., this is very racial. Blacks and Hispanics may not expect progress, but white people in America expected the American dream to be true. And I think when it's turned out for them not to be true, or to be much more difficult, it becomes easy to say this can't possibly, people think, well, I did this on my own, or I didn't do it on my own. The government didn't have anything to do with it. And that's a myth. That's a myth that white people believe. White people, of course, need the government as much as everybody else does. But they've been taught that they don't need help. It's other people that need the help. And so then you can tell them a story which says, well, if you're suffering, it's not that the government can help you. It's that other people are hurting you. The immigrants are taking your stuff. The blacks are taking your stuff. And you get caught in that story because it makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you're special, and it's the other people who are somehow doing something that's wrong. So, I think I understand the narrative logic to it. Another thing which is a huge problem is the lack of local news. Trump votes correlate very highly to inequality and to opioid crisis and to suicide, as you've said, but they also correlate to local news holes. And when people don't have local news, then they have trouble gripping the national news, and they have trouble taking on board the kinds of basic facts that you've cited. Factuality isn't just like an objective thing that you get it or not. You've got to trust something. You've got to trust some institution. And without local news, I think that becomes a lot harder for folks.
Well, this is, of course, where people can have more impact on their local TV, radio, newspaper, weekly. They ought to be able to grasp that. They ought to go down and talk to the editors and reporters, and they'll find some allies there. In other words, we once put out a report, How to Improve Your Daily Newspaper, a manual for readers. And people don't even think of that. And that goes to a comment you made that was real telling. I think makes your case even stronger in terms of why people behave this way in the electoral arena. On page 278, you say, quote, "The cynic who decides that there's no truth is a citizen who welcomes the tyrant. Cynicism about all authority is naivete about the particular authority that reads emotions and breeds cynicism." End quote. Even in relatively formally educated circles, Professor Snyder, cynicism makes people think they're smart. The pox on all your houses. We're smart. We don't fall for all this stuff. But you take a reverse description of it. You say that it's basically self-victimization, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. This is very important. And one of the things I've been trying to do On Tyranny and in this book is to say, look, let's have the courage to say that we believe some things are true and other things are not. Let's not be afraid to look a little bit naive by saying this is true, this is not true. I believe in facts. Because it's this cynical pose, which goes back to the 90s. I think my generation is kind of responsible for it. This idea that we doubt everything. We only believe in irony and paradox, and we talk about tensions, but we don't believe that there's a world out there, really. That pose is politically extremely dangerous because if you give up on believing in anything, then what you end up doing is falling all the harder when someone finds a way to stroke you or finds a way to touch your weak spot. What you're doing is you're pushing the world by dropping the factuality, by pretending to be totally skeptical. What you're doing is you're making the world much more about emotions, much more about psychology, and you're helping the people who are using authoritarian language. You're helping the people who are trying to characterize everything in terms of us and them. And you yourself will end up believing stuff that isn't true. Yeah,
as the way I put it when I was doing campaigning is two kinds of people in politics, citizens. people who believe everything and people who believe nothing, and both stop thinking. See, they both have the same end result. They both stop thinking. Now, it's interesting in your book, you talk about the believability issue, and you say this, quote, "If there's no truth, there can be no trust, and nothing new appears in a human vacuum. Novelty arises within groups, be they entrepreneurs or artists, activists or musicians, and groups need trust. In conditions of distrust and isolation, creativity and energy veer toward paranoia and conspiracy, a feverish repetition of the oldest mistakes. We speak of freedom of association, but freedom is association. Without it, we cannot renew ourselves or challenge our rulers," end quote. I think the issue with Trump is excessive trust by his backers. No matter how many false statements he makes by the hour, they still trust him. It may emerge from some background paranoia, Eastern elites, etc., which has a lot of merit to it in terms of the way a lot of people between the East and West Coast feel these days politically. But what is the antonym to paranoia?
The antonym to paranoia. I think the antonym to paranoia would come back around to the same thing, because the antonym to paranoia would be not being afraid, would be fearlessness, which can also be a mistake. I mean, you could even say that people don't realize what they should be fearing with Mr. Trump. People don't understand what's still good about the republic that can be lost, or what they take for granted as a government service, which can be taken away from them.
What's interesting is there is no word. There is no antonym to paranoia. My sister, who's taught anthropology at Berkeley for over 50 years, coined the word. She called it trustanoia. Excessive trust.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real problem in American politics today.
But it's not. But is it trust or is it faith? I mean, when I talk about trust, like, I trust people that I know. I have some reason to trust them. I can learn to trust them. But I mean, that involves a certain amount of contact. I think with Mr. Trump, it's more a phenomenon of faith. Nobody who actually knows the man trusts him, right, as far as I know. I think everybody who knows him distrusts him. It's only people who don't know him who trust him. And I think if you don't know somebody, then it's really faith rather than trust.
Well, I want to read a little story on page 248, which I think our listeners would connect with, and I'm quoting you. In 1976, Stephen King published a short story titled, "I Know What You Need," end quote, about the courting of a young woman. Her suitor was a young man who could read her mind, but he didn't tell her so. He simply appeared with what she wanted at the moment, beginning with strawberry ice cream for study break. Step by step, he changed her life, making her dependent upon him by giving her what she thought she wanted at a certain moment, before she herself had a chance to reflect. Her best friend realized that something disconcerting was happening, investigated, and learned the truth. Quote, "That is not love," she warned, "that is rape." And you add, "The internet is a bit like this. It knows much about us, but interacts with us without revealing that this is so. It makes us unfree by arousing our worst tribal impulses and placing them at the service of unseen others," end quote. And of course, the main age category that's most excessively victimized by this internet analysis is the young generation. What are your comments?
Well, first of all, I think this is a very important point. I mean, the whole way we think about democracy, the rule of law, comes from a three-dimensional world, whether it's the Greeks or whether it's the founders or whether it's us. And Americans are now spending more than 10 hours a day in front of screens. So they're in some kind of a different world, and that world has different rules. And one of these rules is that, at least on social platforms, you're reinforced in the things that you already think or that you want to hear. And in that way, the internet is not democratic. It's rather authoritarian, because it deliberately doesn't give you time to reflect. It keeps pushing you to become emotionally more the thing that you already are. Now, as to whom it's victimizing, I mean, one thing I find very striking is that the youngest generation is the generation which is least in favor of democracy and most in favor of authoritarianism, which really gives one pause about the way we've been educating them. But I would add that there is an older demographic which is victimized as well, and that's the generation which used to have good newspapers but stopped reading newspapers and now reads the internet as if it were a newspaper without noticing that we've gone from, a curated journalism to something which is really just a kind of emotional loop. So I'm afraid it affects more people than just the young.
And it seems to be just getting underway. It seems to be getting more and more intrusive as millions of people give away their personal information day after day to outfits like Facebook and Google. In your book, you quote Warren Buffett, the mega billionaire from Omaha, and you quote him saying the following, quote, "There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning," unquote. This is a remarkable, candid declaration by Mr. Buffett, who's known for candor. But then you go on to showing the inequalities in American society, and you even touch on the Electoral College, where you basically say, quote, "In most democracies, it would be unthinkable that a candidate who received millions more votes than her rival would lose. That sort of thing happens on a regular basis in American presidential elections, thanks to the indirect and approximate electoral system known as the Electoral College," end quote. Now, for readers of this book, wouldn't it have helped if you indicated that there was a remarkable movement underway called the nationalpopularvote.com that now has states from California to New York passing laws as part of an interstate compact that say that once they reach 270 electoral votes, the states, they will give their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. In other words, neutralizing the Electoral College without having to have a constitutional amendment, because the Constitution gives the states the authority to set election rules. Connecticut just passed this bill, and now this citizen movement with like 7 full-time people, headed by Steve Silberstein, who's been on this program, a retired businessman in California. They've already received enough states, Maryland, Illinois, Connecticut, California, New York, to reach 172 electoral votes. So they're on their way. And I'm curious, as a historian who then goes right into contemporary descriptions of our inequality, why that kind of movement wouldn't have been mentioned in order to reduce some of the discouragement that people might absorb from reading your accurate reality.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's a good psychological point. I mean, this is a contemporary history book, and insofar as it can help people, it helps them by locating us amidst the problems so that we can see them realistically for what they are and not imagine that there are any automatic solutions. At the end of the book, some of the passages of which you've already kindly cited, I do give some general ideas about what I think the political virtues are. But, I couldn't naturally in a book like this tell everyone about all the groups who are working against the problems I mentioned, which in this chapter, it's inequality, it's opioids, it's healthcare, it's gerrymandering, it's the Electoral College. And in all of these cases, there are good people out there who are working for solutions. And, in general, I'm in favor of that. And in specific, I'm in favor of this Electoral College movement. But the general point for me is to show how our democracy has to be democratized in general, and that democracy in America has to be a verb, rather than something that we take for granted. It's something that we still have to make. And with that general point, I completely agree.
There's something strange about our culture, and I've noticed this over the years. It will pay attention to descriptions of disaster, injustice, on like 60 Minutes and other programs and page 1 of the New York Times. But once you start proposing solutions, they get bored with it. In fact, I've been on programs where they want me to talk about our documentation of corporate crime and injustice. And then when I move into what to do about it, the interviewer has this glazed look and they end the interview. What is it about a society whose history proves again and again that it never takes more than 1% of seriously active people in congressional districts representing majority opinion to turn Congress around? Again and again, we have shown that in American history. But there's this disinterest talking about solutions like universal basic income, like full Medicare for all, like a different kind of tax system, like taxing Wall Street transactions. As you know, Wall Street doesn't pay a sales tax on its purchases and sales the way people do for the necessities of life when they walk into stores and have to pay 6, 7, 8% sales tax. Have you run across this? This is really a remarkable disinterest in proposals.
Yeah, no, that's very characteristic of our country. It's like our relationship to our government is like, a relationship between, lovers where like one party wants to complain all the time but doesn't want to hear the other party say, well, maybe we should do this or maybe we should do that. Like maybe we should have date night or maybe we should get divorced. No, it's completely true. And part of it is this myth that's very powerful in this country that you don't need the government, that being a good citizen is about not having a government. And that's just an ideological fight which has to be won. We all need the government. We need the government to work for us. But I think that's the basic stake. The most powerful foes of the things you're talking about are not opposing particular solutions. They're just saying in general government can't do anything. And then, of course, the worse off people get, sadly, the more vulnerable they are to that argument. So there's no substitute for winning little policy battles, because that changes the whole climate of the discussion. But the second thing I want to say is that part of this is news. I think the overall issue here comes back to media. People don't believe that policies can work around them if they don't read local news about little policies that work around them. And so the vacuum of local news then becomes a huge problem on this as well. But you're right, it's something very strange, and it's just about, another thing is Americans don't see the rest of the world, right? So stuff that works in Canada somehow doesn't matter, even though Canada is a big country, multicultural like we are. It can somehow do magically things which we say are impossible, but Americans never see that. We don't see that things are possible in Europe. That we go there on vacation, and it's remarkable how they have trains and how they live longer and how they're taller and and so on. But somehow that's just all exotic. It's not the real world.
That's very true. We did a book called Canada First, making that point you made. For example, Canada still has a paper ballot. They don't have problems with voting machines, hacking software in elections, hanging chads in Florida. They just use paper ballots by 11 o'clock at night in this huge country. They know who won and who lost. Can we learn from Canada? Oh, no, of course, because we're always the best. We're always number one. That's what's inculcated in the students from when they're in kindergarten. America's always number one. We can't learn from the other countries. But to go a little deeper on your point, I'm not just saying government solutions. I'm saying that civic solutions outside of government are not reported by the media. For example, in the New York Times, there is a political section, obviously Section A with the op-ed. They have a sports section. They have a business section. They have an arts section. They have a style section. But they don't have a civic section about what's going on in New York City, all over the boroughs trying to improve their community, just civic engagement. And the same thing is true for civic activity all over the country. It hardly gets any attention on NPR and PBS, shamefully enough. I was told once, we have too many muckraking books. Why don't we have an uplifting book? So I just write this book about time your book on tyranny came out, called Breaking Through Power. It's easier than we think. Important subtitle. It's only 140 pages, paperback, and it didn't sell very well because it had good news. So this is a serious psychological pattern in our country. We can't learn from better examples overseas, and we don't want to seem to publicize the unsung work of millions of little citizen groups all over the country in neighborhoods and communities who are getting things done. So can you train your historical eye on that?
Yeah, it's such a really important point. And it also goes for the way we study history. We study history in terms of things that go drastically wrong or in terms of treaties, but we do a bad job communicating about popular movements. I would also say that, part of the problem is that we don't really have good history classes in the U.S. and we don't have civics, where civics should include not just the Constitution, but the history of civic life in this country. People come out of public schools, unfortunately, with the impression that being an American citizen is about doing your own thing, and that's it. Whereas, American history is actually about people getting together to create the rights that allow you to do your own thing. But again, I would also return to this question of journalism and funding journalism, because the good news stories can only be reported with sustained attention. If a bridge falls down, that's easy to write about. But if you want to write about how a group of parents changes a school in Kansas, you got to cover that story for weeks. And that means you have to have reporters on the ground, which in my view means that we have to start taxing the Google and the Facebook and the people who have sucked up local news in order to find new ways of subsidizing reporters so they can actually be there in these places and cover these stories.
There are all kinds of historical societies locally in Connecticut, for example, and elsewhere, and they don't get many visits. And therefore, for example, in a town where there was some real civic accomplishment 50, 80 years ago, the kids never hear about it, and they don't study even a portion of their history courses on their local community. But because I have an eminent historian, Timothy Snyder from Yale University, on the program, this is the question I really want to ask you. The word democracy is thrown around a great deal. We very rarely see adjectives like this country has a weak democracy, it has a moderate democracy, it has a thin democracy, it has a deep democracy. At what point are we ready to recognize that our country is really not a democracy? I'm not going to get into the republic, that it's a republic. I'm just saying when you have non-competitive elections, third parties obstructed like no other Western society, when you have money buying elections the way we have, nullifying votes, when you have huge wealth inequalities in terms of the influence over state, local, and federal governments, when you can't even count the votes, when you still have voter suppression advancing in all kinds of sophisticated ways, as you point out in your book, The Road to Unfreedom, and on, at what point can we say this country is no longer a democracy? Jimmy Carter has already said it.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to be so categorical as that because as a historian, I look back at the United States in, say, the 1910s or the 1850s and ask what kind of a democracy was that. I mean, only in my lifetime really have African Americans and women both been able to vote, and as you say, we're backsliding on that thanks to the Supreme Court. So democracy is a process. There are advances and there are declines. The way I like to think about it, as a citizen, is that democracy is an aspiration. That is, I'm someone who's very happy to say democracy is a good thing or would be a good thing. If we didn't have the gerrymandering, if we didn't have Citizens United, if we didn't have the Electoral College, if we could make progress on any of these things, we would get better policy outcomes, and people would feel richer and they'd feel a richer connection to their country and to their fellow citizens. So I think democracy is a good thing. We're backsliding, to use the term the political scientists use. We're moving away from it, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't at some point move back towards it. So that's where I stand on this. I don't like to say like white or black, yes or no, because I think it's a historical process where we make a difference.
Well, what you're really saying is the structure for democracy is here. We still have a constitution, but the fulfillment of it has been lacking and has been diminishing. I think that's what you're saying. But let me just extend that a moment. If we uncritically describe our society as a democracy and then describe forces that threaten it, I think we've got too rosy assumption here, because what we need to do is develop some sort of index, the way they do in the business community, some sort of index, some sort of yardsticks, where we can show from year to year various ways we're sliding, like there's voter suppression that worked in Alabama. There's criminal injustice system with minorities. And you point out some of these yardsticks without even calling them yardsticks. But some way, the way we gauge our economy, some way we can get some sort of gauge over the decades of how our democracy has diminished. I can, for example, give you gauges for how Congress has diminished. Congress itself is a very concentrated institution. That is, the 535 members of Congress are themselves operating in a very highly concentrated place where a few members, control the rest, and the money greases the wheels. And Congress now is not having public hearings at all on such things as the war in Iraq or Afghanistan or the tax cut. Years ago, it was unheard of. No matter who controlled Congress, you wouldn't have public hearings. It would go straight to the floor. Congress now has members of Congress whose switchboards are on voicemail hours at a time during the day. So in little and not so little things, you can show that Congress has been less responsive, even though C-SPAN covers it regularly. I talked to Brian Lamb some years ago, and I said, Brian, you now have brought the congressional deliberations to anyone who wants to watch them. And that's supposed to be good for democracy and for a higher quality of Congress. What's your judgment? Is Congress worse now than before you started C-SPAN? He said, it's worse. So you see what I mean? What do you think historians and political scientists can do to develop some sort of structure where we can be more informed about the deterioration of a democratic society?
No, these are all great points. I mean, let me just say three things. The first is that one thing that struck me in the Trump era is how democratization, or the advance or the backslide of democracy, is an international process. So when we do worse, other people do worse just because our example is worse. And when we do better, other people do better. Whether you're on the right or on the left, I don't think any kind of America first is going to make sense. I mean, what we and Russia and the Europeans are all so intimately connected that the democracy, I think, is one international story now, which leads me to the index. There are indices like this. For example, Freedom House, which is now being run by Mike Abramowitz, is actually been quite critical of the United States and is doing a pretty good job, I think, noting how we are participating in the world trend towards authoritarianism. And, you know, he's speaking openly now of things like capitalist authoritarianism, which I think are useful concepts for that very traditional institution, Freedom House, to be using. And then the third thing about Congress, to make a very simple point, like those guys need to be paid a lot more money, and we need to get the money out of the process that elects them. I mean, that's just common sense. They're not paid enough to be taken seriously by the people that they have to deal with, and their campaigns are paid for by, you know, largely untraceable sources. That takes us away from democracy, because democracy is one person, one vote. The more money there is, the more our votes are diluted. I mean, everybody listening to this knows that.
Well, that's good. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Professor Timothy Snyder, historian at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, author of the forthcoming, now coming book, The Road to Unfreedom. And thanks for making people think. I hope you have a lot of interviews.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure talking to you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking to Professor Timothy Snyder, whose new book is entitled The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America. We will link to that and more of Professor Snyder's work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we're going to talk about the prospects for adding a 51st state. But before we do that, we're going to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 18, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A salmonella outbreak that led to the recall of nearly 207 million eggs has now sickened nearly 36 people in states along the East Coast. 35 people have been sickened by the salmonella outbreak, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said this week. The outbreak, which had been traced to a single egg producer, has resulted in 11 hospitalizations. No deaths have been reported. In April, Rose Acre Farms recalled its products after federal officials tied the illnesses to the company's facility in North Carolina. The recalled eggs were sold under brand names such as Great Value, Country Daybreak, and Crystal Farms. They were also sold to Waffle House restaurants and Food Lion stores. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. There are over 700,000 people who live in this country but do not have the same rights as the rest of us. I'm not talking about undocumented immigrants. I'm talking about people who live in Washington, D.C. David?
Mark Plotkin writes for the political website The Hill. He's a contributor to the BBC on American politics and is also a columnist for the D.C. paper The Georgetowner. He previously worked as the political analyst for WAMU-FM, Washington's NPR affiliate, and for WTOP-FM, Washington's all-news radio station. He is a winner of the Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence in Writing. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Mark Plotkin.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yes, indeed. Mark Plotkin has been the most ferocious advocate for D.C. statehood, and it's really been going on for decades. If someone asked you, Mark, which do you think will come first, Palestinian statehood or D.C. statehood? What would your answer?
I've never been asked that question, and I'm torn, but I would think probably D.C. statehood, even though that's unfortunately now, based on past history, not a ascertainable thing. I can create a scenario, Ralph, and I hate fawning after the fox, but no presidential candidate or person of national visibility has been more outspoken than Ralph Nader. So this is a symbiotic, mutual admiration society. And I thank you.
We're on WPFW now in Washington, D.C., so this is a very compelling subject. And we've been at rallies together, and we've been at news conferences together, and nothing happens. But you can trace the history of D.C. statehood attempts in terms of there were some almost something really happening in the past. And I want to just say for listeners, there isn't enough empathy around the country for this. Just think if you're in Alaska or Florida or Connecticut and you didn't have a vote for 2 senators and a representative that actually had binding voting power, what would you think? And I think it's correct to say, Mark Plotkin, that we're the only capital city in the world where there are elections and the people in the capital city cannot elect members of their parliament.
Yes, that is true. And please abbreviate me or cut me off, but I'll give a rapid history. You didn't mention Ralph, which should be mentioned. It wasn't until 1964, the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, where the residents of the District of Columbia, the capital of the free world and the democracy, got the opportunity to vote for president. In 1978, nobody remembers this, and Jimmy Carter should be heralded for this. I think this is what you were referencing to. And we should make a distinction between voting rights and statehood. Statehood is the big enchilada. It's sovereignty. Voting rights means you get to join the club, which is the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And there was a D.C. Voting Rights Amendment in 1978, and as you full well know, requires 2/3, quite a high numerical hurdle, in both the House and the Senate, and then goes out to the state legislatures for ratification. In 78, such noted liberals as Barry Goldwater, Howard Baker, Bob Dole, and of all people, Strom Thurmond, voted for the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment, which is not statehood, but gives you representation in both the House and the Senate. Full representation went out to the states, and only 16 states of the required 38 ratified. Nothing happened till 1993, and that was the last time there has actually been a vote in the U.S. House of Representatives. There were 153 votes for it. There was one Republican, 151 Democrats. Bernie Sanders, as an independent, was in the House, and Wayne Gilchrist, a high school civics teacher, Republican from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, voted for it. In the Senate, it went nowhere because John Glenn, the supposed national hero, refused to even have a hearing on the bill. And then Jim Sasser concurred with that. And then finally, in 2014, Tom Carper, the senator from Delaware, who chaired the committee, Democrats were in the majority. Harry Reid came onto the bill, even though he was the majority leader. And our non-voting delegate, we have a delegate could vote committee, but not on the floor. Both Carper and were only they didn't get any Democratic senators at the hearing. The bill was never marked up, and the only person who showed up was a Republican, since departed Tom Coburn. So, Ralph, it's a pretty serious set of affairs. It's also not been in the platform. Eleanor Holmes Norton, our delegate, removed it from being on the Democratic Party platform. And what you talked about, the question of fairness, but more than anything, it's a national ignorance. The Democratic Party talks a good game, but they don't move. We had opportunities in 93 and 2009. And
let's talk about 2009, Mark Plotkin.
Great.
That was the best. Obama was in the White House. The Democrats controlled decisively the House and the Senate. And I think Obama made some good words about statehood during the campaign. So tell us what happened there.
Well, I'm the first person that asked him about statehood at a public housing project in D.C., and at that time the only person who supported him, besides the later imprisoned governor of Illinois, Blagojevich, was Adrian Fenty, the mayor. And although, Ralph, he was supportive, I would call it tenuous support. He said, get more Democrats elected.
This is when he was campaigning?
That's right, when he was campaigning. And then there was a license plate. Our license plate in the district says taxation without representation. It took him 5 years to put that license plate on after Bill Clinton put it on, took it off, and it took him 5 years. And he had a famous episode. I won't want you to be too favorable. In budget negotiations with John Boehner, I think you'll remember he said, "I'll give you D.C.," giving up the abortion legislation when he needed a budget deal. He never spoke of it. He never cared about the issue. And in 2009, and I plead guilty to this, there was a deal that Tom Davis, a Republican congressman from Georgia, from Virginia, said that we would expand the House of Representatives from 435 to 437, and Utah would get a seat, and we would get a seat, passed in both houses, but then Senator Ensign of Nevada, who's no longer there, put on some crippling gun bills, so even this modicum of democracy was not allowed. And in 2009, to get to your point, finally, we should have gone for statehood, not for that incremental change, because the votes were there.
Well, I've often said this to you. You couldn't get more than 500 people in the district to take time out and really campaign for statehood. There's a real apathy in the District of Columbia. We had an entire afternoon at Constitution Hall, the historic Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., devoted to D.C. statehood. It had 3,500 seats. We couldn't get more than 300 seats filled. We put posters and publicity all over the District of Columbia, and the mayor didn't even deign to come and open the session. So what do you say to critics who say, that's a good idea, but, most of you are very comfortable in the District of Columbia or apathetic or powerless, but, why aren't there mass rallies around the White House and around Congress?
I thought the best statement ever was by Jesse Jackson in answer to your question. I know you don't think I'll answer your question, but I will. I said, when will it change? And he said, when it rises to the level of personal insult. And people are not insulted by the fact that I've always thought, Ralph, it's psychological and sociological. Don't view it politically. View it like a black person not being able to go to a hotel, a Jewish person not joining a country club, a Irish need not apply or get any other ethnic group. It is purposeful, legal, and deliberate exclusion. And the population, the indigenous population, should be blamed. If they're not so concerned about their colonial status and their second-class citizenship, why should I be?
Well, make it clear how committees of Congress run by people thousands of miles away control the D.C. budget. They can overturn D.C. referendums. Give some examples on how.
Yeah, well, not only referendums, every law that the D.C. Council passes, there's 13 members, can be negated. The actual government of the District of Columbia, with an elected mayor and a 13-member council, can be abolished. This is tyranny. We're given a modicum of local control. Our judges are not appointed by or elected by the local citizenry. They're appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Every penny we raise can, as you said, can be abrogated, deleted, and there just isn't the outrage from the local population nor the knowledge of the U.S. country. And we don't have a leader. We had leaders in the Senate, Paul Simon and Ted Kennedy. We're in the House. Pelosi, the minority leader, and Steny Hoyer are very good and very supportive. But I've always thought Republicans won't allow it because they think 76% of the registered voters are Democrats, and they feel it'll be two more Democratic senators. There's talk about bringing in Puerto Rico at the same time. There's also, Ralph, as a lawyer, questions about can it be done by a simple majority vote, because there's the district clause. Does that, in the Constitution, does it have to be done by constitutional amendment? My point is, if the Democrats control the House and Senate, make it a party line vote the first day of the U.S. Congress, maybe we'll have a Democratic president in 2 years, or even Trump is crazy enough to sign something he doesn't really know about and move the bill. And that's what has not been done. The Democratic leadership, especially in the Senate, George Mitchell wouldn't even give Jesse Jackson a meeting when he was the elected statehood senator to lobby for the District of Columbia.
Well, we do have a delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton. She's been elected by people in the district to represent the district. She doesn't have a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives, and she's seeking a 15th term. Talk about Eleanor Holmes Norton, a civil rights leader.
She is given semi-icon status, and I'm sure she did. I think she did do good work. She was the first female head of the Equal Opportunity Commission. She got elected in 1990, and there's an article today in the Washington Post, which I would refer to. A young, attractive African-American woman named Kim Ford is running against her. And the problem with Eleanor Holmes Norton, and I'll tell you exactly with an anecdote, I say she defines defeat as victory. The 153 votes that they got in 1993, she takes credit for getting a vote. No, it's not getting a vote, Eleanor. It's winning the vote. There were overwhelming majorities. In 2014, the majority leader, Harry Reid, went on the bill. There could have been a vote in the U.S. Senate because he would have scheduled a vote. It get out of Tom Carper's committee, and I said to Delegate Norton, have you seen Claire McCaskill? Have you seen Begich? Have you seen Land? And she said to me, Ralph, and I want this to have widest possible dissemination, she said, you go see them. So there's a con job going on where there's a rhetorical commitment to the issue, but not the real substantive commitment of getting Democratic senators to vote for the issue.
Well, what do we do now? There are very rich people in the district. We've talked about it. Somebody would pony up $10 to $15 million for a organizing campaign throughout the District of Columbia. Things may start to happen. But let me put it this way, Mark Plotkin. 2 listeners, one outside the District of Columbia around the country. What could they do? And what do people do in the District of Columbia? You've thought about this.
Yeah, good question. The person outside the district can, any town hall meeting for a House member or a senator, bring up this issue and ask them, where do you stand on it? And be an advocate for fairness and democracy and say, you want 700,000 residents of the district, the nation's capital, to be included in America's democracy. Anybody who's raising money for Senate candidates or House candidates in the living rooms of rich people bring up the issue. We suffer, Ralph, from a terrible absence of visibility. And then in this city, I've sort of comically said we need a Michael Bloomberg, somebody who wants to be governor or senator of the state of New Columbia but doesn't want to move. Failing that, we need people of means they got to care about the issue. They have to feel personally insulted that they are deliberately excluded. I've been here since 1964, and I came from Chicago, where politics is really a blood sport, but also we care so much about voting, we used to vote 3 or 4 times on election day. All kidding aside, the point is there's got to be a change of climate here where people are offended by this exclusion.
On that note, what's the D.C. Statehood website that people around the country in D.C. can
I really know. You can try DC Vote, which I think is a tepid organization that is for representation, not much for statehood. But we forgot to mention, and I'll finally point out, the local legislature, the council. They're the second highest paid people in the country next to the California's legislature, and they are intent on preserving and perpetuating their status as the only game in town. They should be working to remove themselves and go to a higher level. So you need a seismic shift in attitude and actual achievement, and you really do need a new person as the delegate.
And the best website? DC Vote will give you at least information, right?
Yeah. DC Vote will give you the information, or call the DC Council at 202-724-8000. Ask for the chairman's office and ask that person to tell you, or call the mayor's office and ask what it is. We don't even have a committee in the council, even a subcommittee that has to do with state, because they want to perpetuate their colonial existence.
On that realistic note, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Mark Plotkin.
Thank you very much for asking.
In this. This is a litmus paper test for democracy, as you said, around the country. And people in the district need help from people outside to contact their senators and representatives and say, what's going on here? How can the capital of the USA keeps stripping people of their right to have voting senators and representatives in the U.S. Congress. Thank you very much, Mark Plotkin.
Thank you for all your help.
We've been speaking to journalist Mark Plotkin. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now, before we do anything else, Ralph, you wanted to make a comment about the situation going on in Gaza these past few weeks.
Well, it's what Amnesty International called a murderous assault on peaceful protests by men, women, and children near the fence. The fence is not the border with Israel. It's at least 300 meters into Gaza land. And it's really amazing, the contrast here. There's far more dissent and criticism of the Israeli government in the Israeli Knesset than there is in the U.S. Congress. There's been criticism of their illegal blockade of Gaza, blockading necessary food, medicine. Drinking water is 97% contaminated. 1 million children are growing up poisoned by contaminated drinking water. Poverty, huge anemia. There are 2 million people living in an area just twice the size of the District of Columbia. Of course, this is all being done by the Israeli militarists with the backing of Donald Trump and the U.S. Congress, the billions of dollars in aid, military aid. And what's forgotten is that in 2002, over 15 countries, Arab countries, including Egypt and at the time Iraq and Syria and others, 15 so-called Islamic countries signed a letter to the Israeli government saying that if they would go back to the 1967 borders and have a two-state solution with capitals in West and East Jerusalem, there would be full recognition of Israel, normalization of diplomatic relations, and trade. And that offer was repeated again and again, sometimes with full-page ads in the New York Times, rejected by Israel. And that's often forgotten. What else is forgotten is that David Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel, has said in a memorable statement that was widely circulated about the Palestinians, quote, "It was their land and we took it," end quote. Very candid. But behind a lot of this is incredible racism against Arabs. It's not just, regular soldiers or people who are bigoted in any society saying terrible things about the Arabs, but here is Menachem Begin, prime minister. He said, quote, "The Palestinians are beasts walking on two legs," end quote. Here's Rabbi Eli Ben-Dahan, who is current deputy minister of defense. Quote, "Palestinians are beasts. They are not human," end quote. Quote, "A Jew always has a much higher soul than a Gentile, even if he's a homosexual," end quote. And you just go on with officials in the Israeli government, party members, saying the most awful things about Palestinians, which I and others have called a reverse anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitism against Arabs. And it's also against the African refugees that they want to expel with a one-way ticket. They've reversed that. But it goes all the way back to Golda Meir, who was an Israeli prime minister, originally from Milwaukee, and her famous phrase is, quote, "There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. It's not as if we came here and threw them out and took their country. They didn't exist," end quote. That's a statement to the London Sunday Times in 1968. On the black African refugees, the quote by a former IDF spokeswoman and current Minister of Culture in 2012, Miri Regev, she said, quote, "The Sudanese are a cancer in our body. We will do everything to send them back where they came from," end quote. So we have to get more information about all this and just recognize reality. It was Ariel Sharon who in 2001, talking to Shimon Peres, who for years was president of Israel, this is reported on Israeli radio, quote, "Every time we do something, you tell me America will do this and will do that. I want to tell you something very clear. Don't worry about American pressure on Israel. We, the Jewish people, control America, and the Americans know it," end quote. So we have to jettison this taboo of discussion. Jewish Voices for Peace has now over 100,000 members. A majority of Jewish Americans, 68% in the recent poll, opposed the shift of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And yet the Congress, only about 10 members of Congress have spoken up mildly objecting to the slaughter by Israeli snipers of Palestinian protesters. So it's been called by international legal experts, Gaza has been called the world's largest open-air prison. They can't escape even if they want to, which is different from other places in the Middle East where there's turmoil and brutality. You have refugees who at least can try to run away. In Gaza, they can't do that. 2 million people. So I think that's a responsibility of the U.S. government. And with Donald Trump, it is not auspicious that the human rights of the Palestinian people and recognition of all these Arab nations wanting to negotiate a peace accord is going to get recognized. Not with John Bolton as his national security advisor or Michael Pompeo as his Secretary of State. They're extremely belligerent, extremely prejudiced against Arabs.
All right, well, that's our show. I want to thank our guest again today, Professor Timothy Snyder, author of The Road to Unfreedom, and journalist Mark Plotkin, who told us all about the status of D.C. statehood, or lack thereof. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up.
For Ralph's weekly column, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
Visit the American Museum of Tort Law and go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week when our guests will be financial industry expert Nomi Prinz and Mark Rotenberg, who's going to talk to us about privacy on Facebook. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, David, Steve, Jimmy. It is going to be a great program next week. And stand up, speak up, by all means. It only takes 1% or less in congressional districts, backed by majority opinion, and there's plenty of that on new redirections for our country to turn Congress around.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up. In this first part, Professor Timothy Snyder talks about America's surprising disadvantage in the cyber war with Russia.
So I'm glad to be able to talk about America. It's the first time that's really happened. It's been all Russia.
I'd love to see a debate between you and Steve Cohen.
Oh, that ain't going to happen. He would never do that. But yeah. The thing about Russia, for me, it's not like treating Russia as some evil external thing. It's that Russia represents a place where we can go. And it's just a mistake that people on the left make to think that Russia is some kind of positive alternative or it provides views about the U.S. that are useful. Russia shows how you can govern from extreme wealth inequality with spectacle, and that's where we're going. And that's how Russia is useful for us.
What's interesting? What are we doing to Russia on the cyber thing politically? Don't we hack them at all?
The thing that they do to us is possible because we get our news from the internet, whereas Russians don't. And it's possible because they've got 1 million people who know English, and we don't have that many people who know Russian. And our internet is totally open and unregulated, and theirs isn't. So the kind of offensive cyber they did to us, where they're trying to mess with the national psychology, even though we developed those tactics ourselves and we have them, we could never do that to Russia. So, because they're just not.
That's
open
a good
to
op-ed, because a lot of people are saying, "Hey, we developed this. They're using our stuff. Aren't we retaliating?"
I'm sure we would if we could. But this is like one of the problems of being an open society and also being really naive about the internet is that you open yourself up to this.
That's a really good op-ed. You ought to think of that. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, Steve and David engage Ralph more about the situation in Gaza.
Ralph, how do you think the New York Times, for instance, has covered this latest Gaza thing in conjunction, I guess, with the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem? How do you assess their coverage of that? Because they're kind of the leading voice in America on such things.
There's always been a problem with the New York Times reporters in Israel. They're very deep into Israeli government. Isabel Kushner has been there for years. They're trying to broaden out the coverage with new reporters, But it's still the kind of coverage that indicates that this is a clash between the Israelis and the Palestinians, as if there's anything symmetrical about the slaughter. Before this latest slaughter, the ratio of innocent Palestinians killed and injured compared to innocent Israelis was 400 to 1. And now, of course, it's much greater than that. The New York Times has got to do a much better job.
Have the Palestinians lost the Saudi Arabians?
Well, it's further complicated because Egypt is now allying itself with Israel and closing the border, except for a few openings with the so-called Rafah border. Saudi Arabia is courting Israel now because they both hate Iran and fear Iran. So the poor Palestinians are really surrounded. They have no allies anymore. And in Gaza, it is really a humanitarian crisis of the first proportion.
There is no country speaking for the Palestinians. Is Iran, I guess, is it Iran now?
Well, Iran speaks up on it, but Iraq is sort of silent. They have their own problems after George W. Bush blew it apart with Dick Cheney in 2003. Syria is in total chaos and multiple types of civil wars. There is some support from Lebanon, but it doesn't amount to much political power. In the U.S., with our ambassador there, Nikki Haley, has a veto, and she has absolutely no sympathy whatsoever for Palestinian men, women, and children. The racism goes so far as to seriously upset the Israeli soldiers who are now called refuseniks, and they refuse to serve in the West Bank and Gaza operations. And one of the things they point to is in the 2000 war on Gaza by Israel, Israeli soldiers, some of them, wore T-shirts with a pregnant Palestinian woman in crosshairs with the slogan, quote, "One shot, 2 kills," end quote.
Are conditions in the West Bank markedly better than Gaza? It is livable in the West Bank, the settlements notwithstanding.
Nothing could be worse than Gaza. I mean, Gaza is one of the worst humanitarian crises. Massive anemia among the children, huge spreads of cancer, undernourishment, medicines not being allowed in, drinking water contaminated, unable to grow their own crops. There are farmers trying to grow some of the crops, and they fear being sniped from the Israeli side. And it's as if the Palestinians don't have a right to defend themselves. You know how members of Congress and Donald Trump keep saying Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, Israel is the fourth most powerful military power in the world. It's the occupier. It's the colonizer. It goes in anywhere it wants and smashes up houses and grabs people without any due process. What about the Palestinians having a right to defend themselves? So I think we're seeing a shift in American public opinion, clearly, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, led by a dramatic shift of Jewish Americans.
Yeah, that's who's going to have to lead it.
Why isn't the UN occupying Gaza? Why are there not peacekeepers going in there? And
because Israel prevents it. They don't want any peacekeepers between them and the West Bank and Gaza. They're very clear about that.
Specifically Gaza, because it just feels, I don't know.
Yeah. They don't want anything that interferes with their flexibility to do anything militarily. I mean, they're totally adamant about that. The UN is in for relief, for charity and food. And on the first attack in Gaza in 2009, they blew up the UN premises and they blew up the American International School there. I mean, I'm telling you, it's really amazing. You got to read the reports in Haaretz, which I'm sure you do, but time to time. Gideon Levy, Amira Haas. These are unbelievably courageous Israeli journalists, and the reports of B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group. That's all you have to do. See what's going on there.
I mean, I would assume it's not Gaza is no longer a source of cheap labor for the Israelis anymore. Do they allow anybody in from Gaza now?
No.
To exploit?
Just once in a while, medical emergencies, but they have to wait. Yeah, once in a while, like cancer treatments, and they have Arab and Israeli doctors working side by side in these hospitals. It's off once that was on Democracy Now. They get the cheap labor from the West Bank.
So what? They're just going to. They have no plan for Gaza, other than just to keep.
They need Gaza for their internal political machinations. That's the problem with Netanyahu. You know, he's got to deal with these coalition parties. He's got to throw the Labor Party and the Meretz Party on the defensive, and it's the old technique. You know, it's the threat from abroad. They need it. That's the problem. That's why they haven't responded to this. I think it was 19 Arab and Muslim countries. 19 still on the table, more than ever, because Saudi Arabia, as was pointed out, and others are siding with Israel more and more. They don't want peace. First of all, there's a military-industrial complex there. Second, there are huge arms exports there. Third, they can't get American aid unless they show they're surrounded by existential threats. And fourth, that's how they put the more moderate political forces in Israel on the defensive, to shut them up. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, in this country? Remember Iraq?
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we welcome back financial industry expert Nomi Prinz, who will tell us how central bankers have rigged the world. And then first-time guest Mark Rottenberg will talk about privacy on Facebook.